Young nurse bathed a billionaire in a coma, but he suddenly woke up and kissed her. Sophie's footsteps echoed through the marble foyer as she followed Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper, into the Hawthorne estate. Her hands clutched her nursing bag tightly, her knuckles white with nervous energy. The grandeur of the mansion made her feel small, out of place in her simple navy scrubs. "As you can see, the main living areas are through here," Mrs. Henderson said, gesturing with a practiced sweep of her arm. The elderly housekeeper moved with purpose, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun. "Though you'll primarily be stationed upstairs in Mr. Hawthorne's private wing." Sophie nodded, trying to take in everything at once. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow patterns across pristine white walls. Priceless artwork hung in heavy gilt frames. The plush carpet beneath her practical shoes probably cost more than her entire apartment. "Kitchen's through there if you need anything," Mrs. Henderson continued, leading Sophie up a sweeping staircase. "I always keep healthy snacks and fresh coffee available. Your breaks can be taken in the staff room or garden, whichever you prefer." They passed several closed doors before stopping at the end of a long hallway. Mrs. Henderson's expression softened slightly as she placed her hand on the doorknob. "This is Mr. Hawthorne's room. He's been stable but unresponsive since the accident 3 weeks ago." The housekeeper's voice caught slightly. "He's a good man, Miss Sophie. The best employer I've had in 40 years of service." Sophie felt her heart squeeze at the obvious affection in the older woman's voice. "I'll take excellent care of him, Mrs. Henderson. I promise." The room they entered was large but surprisingly homey. Warm wood paneling covered the walls, and large windows overlooked manicured gardens. Medical equipment had been seamlessly integrated into the space, making it feel more like a luxury hotel suite than a sick room. And there, in the center of it all, lay Caleb Hawthorne. Sophie approached the bed slowly, taking in her patient's appearance. Despite the circumstances, he looked peaceful. Dark hair fell across his forehead, and his strong jawline was shadowed with several days' stubble. He was younger than she'd expected, probably in his mid-30s. "The previous nurse left detailed notes here," Mrs. Henderson said, indicating a tablet on the bedside table. "All his medications and schedules are logged in the system. Dr. Matthews visits every other day to check his progress." Sophie set her bag down and pulled out her stethoscope. "Would you mind if I did a quick assessment?" "Of course not, dear. I'll leave you to it. Dinner is at 6 if you'd like to join me in the kitchen." With that, Mrs. Henderson quietly left the room. Moving with practiced efficiency, Sophie began checking Caleb's vital signs. His heart was strong and steady under her stethoscope. She recorded his blood pressure, temperature, and oxygen levels, all reassuringly normal. "Well, Mr. Hawthorne," she said softly, organizing his evening medications. "It looks like it's just you and me." She glanced at his still form as she prepared the various pills and injections. What kind of man was he? The mansion spoke of immense wealth, but Mrs. Henderson's obvious devotion suggested something beyond mere money. Sophie carefully measured liquid medication into a syringe, her mind wandering. The business magazines in the waiting room of the nursing agency had painted him as a brilliant but ruthless investor. Yet something about his peaceful expression made her wonder if there was more to the story. A warm evening breeze drifted through the open window, carrying the scent of roses from the garden below. Sophie took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. Whatever mysteries surrounded Caleb Hawthorne would have to wait. Right now, her job was to care for him, and that's exactly what she intended to do. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Caleb's room as Sophie arrived for her first full shift. She'd barely slept the night before, going over protocols and patient notes in her mind. Now, standing in the peaceful quiet of the mansion, her anxiety began to fade into familiar routine. "Good morning, Mr. Hawthorne," she said softly, setting her bag down. It felt a bit silly talking to someone in a coma, but her training taught her that patients could sometimes hear even when unresponsive. Besides, the silence felt too heavy without some conversation. She moved around the room with practiced efficiency, checking the various machines and recording his vital signs in the tablet. Everything looked stable. Blood pressure normal, oxygen levels good, heart rate steady. "Time to get you a bit more comfortable," Sophie murmured, preparing to adjust his position. It was important to move coma patients regularly to prevent bed sores and maintain circulation. With gentle hands, she shifted his shoulders, carefully supporting his head. He was a solid man, tall and well-built, making the task more challenging than she'd expected. As she worked, she couldn't help noticing little details about him: a small scar near his left eyebrow, the slight crease between his brows that remained even in unconsciousness, the way his dark eyelashes contrasted against his pale skin. "I wonder what happened to you," she said quietly, smoothing his blanket. The staff notes mentioned an accident, but details were sparse. A man in his prime, successful and wealthy, now lying here so still and vulnerable. The day passed in a steady rhythm of care routines. Sophie checked his catheter, administered medications, performed range-of-motion exercises on his limbs, and monitored his vital signs. Between tasks, she read aloud from the morning newspaper, telling herself it was good therapy, though she secretly enjoyed having someone to talk to, even if they couldn't respond. Mrs. Henderson brought her lunch, a delicious homemade soup, and shared stories about Caleb's kindness to his employees. "He remembered my grandson's birthday last year," the housekeeper said, her eyes misting. "Sent him a signed jersey from his favorite basketball team." As evening approached, Sophie prepared for shift change. The night nurse would arrive soon, and she wanted everything in perfect order. She was doing one final check of his vital signs when she noticed something different. His breathing pattern changed, deeper, more pronounced. Then, ever so slightly, his fingers twitched against the sheets. Sophie's heart leaped into her throat, into her. She quickly pressed the call button for Mrs. Henderson while keeping her eyes fixed on Caleb's hand. There it was again, a definite movement of his index finger. "Mr. Hawthorne?" she called softly, leaning closer. "Caleb, can you hear me?" She watched intently, hardly daring to breathe herself. These could be promising signs, or they might be involuntary movements. In her experience with coma patients, the path to consciousness was rarely straightforward. Sophie grabbed the small pen light from her pocket and carefully checked his pupil response. His breathing remained deeper than before, and she noticed small movements in his facial muscles. Her own pulse raced as she monitored every slight change, determined not to miss any potential sign of awakening. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room as Sophie prepared for Caleb's daily bath. She had settled into a comfortable routine over the past few days, methodically gathering supplies: warm water, soft washcloths, gentle soap, and fresh linens. "All right, Mr. Hawthorne," she said in her usual cheerful tone. "Let's get you cleaned up before the evening shift arrives." She worked with practiced efficiency, carefully washing his face and neck first. The room was quiet except for the soft splashing of water and the steady beep of monitors. Sophie hummed softly as she moved the warm washcloth across his shoulders, maintaining a professional detachment despite his physical presence. "You know," she said conversationally, "Mrs. Henderson told me the most wonderful stories about you yesterday, about how you helped her grandson. It's nice to know there are still people who—" The words died in her throat as Caleb's eyes suddenly flickered open. Dark brown eyes, alert and intense, locked onto hers. Sophie froze, the washcloth suspended in mid-air, water dripping onto the sheets. Her medical training screamed at her to react, to call for help, to check his vitals, but she remained rooted to the spot, caught in his unwavering gaze. Before she could process what was happening, Caleb leaned forward with surprising strength. His hand found the back of her neck, and his lips pressed against hers. The kiss was soft but urgent, as if he'd been waiting an eternity for this moment. It lasted only seconds, but time seemed to stand still in that pristine hospital room. Sophie's mind whirled with confusion as she pulled back, her cheeks flushing hot. The washcloth fell forgotten to the floor as she stumbled backward, her hip bumping against the bedside table. The water basin wobbled precariously. Mr. Hawthorne, she stammered, trying to reclaim her professional composure. Her heart hammered against her ribs, and she could still feel the warmth of his lips on hers. Caleb blinked slowly, confusion crossing his features, as awareness seemed to seep back into his consciousness. He looked around the room, taking in the medical equipment and his unfamiliar surroundings. When his gaze returned to Sophie, there was a mix of embarrassment and something else, something that made her pulse quicken. "You're real," he whispered, his voice hoarse from disuse. I've been hearing your voice, for days, I think, reading to me, talking to me." He swallowed hard, wincing slightly. "You were the only one who made me feel human, not just another patient, not just another responsibility." Sophie reached for the cup of water on the bedside table with trembling hands. "Here," she offered, helping him take small sips through the straw. Her nursing instincts finally kicked in, though her emotions remained in turmoil. "Thank you," Caleb said softly after drinking. His eyes never left her face. "Thank you for being the first person who truly cared for me. I felt it, even in the darkness. Your kindness, your compassion." Sophie stood there, her professional training warring with the unexpected feelings surging through her. She should be checking his vitals, calling his doctor, following proper protocols for a patient awakening from a coma. Instead, she found herself lost in his grateful gaze, her heart racing with an emotion she dared not name. I need to call your doctor," she managed to say, though she made no move towards the call button. Sophie finally managed to press the call button, and within minutes, the room was buzzing with activity. Doctors and nurses swarmed around Caleb, checking his vitals and performing various tests. Sophie stepped back, allowing them to work, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from him. Even amid the commotion, Caleb's gaze kept finding its way back to her. After what seemed like hours, the medical team finally cleared out, leaving just Dr. Martinez to explain Caleb's condition. The prognosis was remarkably good, no apparent lasting damage from the coma. When the doctor left, an awkward silence filled the room. "I suppose I should apologize," Caleb said, his voice stronger now after sipping more water. "For the unexpected greeting earlier." A hint of a smile played at the corners of his mouth, despite his obvious exhaustion. Sophie felt her cheeks warm again. "It's okay. Sometimes patients can be disoriented when they first wake up." She busied herself adjusting his pillows, trying to maintain her professional demeanor. "I wasn't disoriented," he said quietly. "I knew exactly what I was doing." Sophie's hands stilled on the pillow. "Mr. Hawthorne. Please, call me Caleb." He shifted in the bed, wincing slightly. "I heard everything while I was under, you know. Your voice was like a lighthouse in the darkness. You read to me, talked about your day. You treated me like a person, not just another wealthy patient." Sophie pulled up a chair beside his bed, her nursing training kicking in despite her jumbled emotions. "Can you tell me what you remember from before the coma?" Caleb's expression darkened. The accident, the betrayal, my own brother trying to take control of my company while I was vulnerable. His hands clenched into fists on the blanket. 3 months of my life. Gone. Just gone. I'm so sorry, Sophie said softly, resisting the urge to place her hand over his. The company I built from nothing. My own family turning against me. His voice cracked slightly. I wake up to find everything I worked for hanging by a thread. My identity was always tied to being successful, being in control. Now. He gave a bitter laugh. I'm not even sure who I am anymore. Sophie watched as various emotions played across his face. Anger, hurt, loss. Despite his wealthy background and powerful position, in this moment he seemed utterly human, vulnerable in a way that tugged at her heart. You're still you, she said gently. Your success doesn't define who you are as a person. Caleb turned to look at her, his dark eyes intense. And who am I, Sophie? The man who wakes up and kisses his nurse? The fallen titan of industry? The brother who couldn't see betrayal coming? You're someone who inspired your staff to visit you every week while you were in the coma, Sophie replied. Someone whose housekeeper tells stories about your kindness. Someone who, even unconscious, made me want to come to work every day. A charged silence fell between them. Sophie could feel something shifting in the air, a connection that went beyond patient and nurse. It both thrilled and terrified her. I don't know what I would have done without your voice these past weeks, Caleb said softly. It gave me something to hold on to, something real. Sophie stood up, smoothing her uniform with trembling hands. The professional part of her knew she should maintain boundaries, but another part of her couldn't deny the pull she felt toward him. She didn't know what to make of these feelings, or of the way he looked at her, like she was the only solid thing in his crumbling world. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the mansion's tall windows as Sophie checked Caleb's vital signs. His recovery was progressing remarkably well, though he still tired easily. Today he seemed more alert, watching her movements with keen interest. You know, Caleb said, adjusting himself against the pillows. Before all this happened, I never sat still for more than an hour. Always rushing from one meeting to another, one project to the next. Sophie smiled as she recorded his blood pressure. That must have been exhausting. Actually, it was exhilarating. His eyes lit up with remembered passion. Every day brought new opportunities to make a difference. I didn't just want to build a successful company. I wanted to change lives. Setting aside her clipboard, Sophie settled into the chair beside his bed. How so? My foundation focused on education initiatives, primarily. Scholarships for underprivileged students, funding for rural schools, literacy programs. Caleb's voice grew stronger as he spoke. We also started a program helping small businesses stay afloat during tough times. Interest-free loans, debt restructuring, whatever it took to keep families from losing everything. That's amazing, Sophie said softly, genuinely impressed. Most people in your position would just focus on making more money. Caleb shook his head. Money's worthless if you can't use it to help others. My parents taught me that. They didn't have much, but they always shared what they had. His expression clouded. I thought my brother understood that too. Guess I was wrong. Sophie leaned forward slightly. What happened with your brother? While I was in the coma, he tried to redirect foundation funds into personal accounts, claimed it was restructuring to save the company. Caleb's jaw tightened. He nearly destroyed everything we built, everything we stood for. But you stopped him? My legal team did, thank God. But the foundation's work has been stalled for months now. He rubbed his temples. So many people counting on that help. Sophie adjusted his blanket, noting how his hands trembled slightly with emotion. You'll rebuild it, she said confidently. The world needs people who care like you do. Caleb caught her hand as she withdrew it, his touch gentle but electric. Thank you, Sophie, for believing in me. She felt her cheeks flush and carefully withdrew her hand. Looking at her watch, she realized her shift was almost over. I should get going. My family's expecting me for dinner tonight. Of course, Caleb nodded. Everything okay at home? Sophie hesitated, then sighed. Mostly. Dad's garage isn't doing so well. The economy's hit small businesses hard. Mom's picking up extra shifts at the diner, and my sister's college tuition is due soon. She shrugged, trying to seem casual. But we'll manage. We always do. Something flickered in Caleb's eyes. Recognition, concern, but his expression remained neutral. I'm sure you will, he said quietly. Sophie gathered her things, suddenly feeling awkward about sharing so much. Good night, Mr. Hawthorne. Caleb, I'll see you tomorrow. As she walked to her car, Sophie's mind whirled with thoughts of Caleb, his passion, his kindness, the way he looked at her. But she also couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted during their conversation, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. Sophie collapsed onto her small apartment's couch, kicking off her shoes after another long day at the mansion. Her phone buzzed, Mom's familiar ringtone. She took a deep breath before answering. Hi, Mom. How are you holding up? Her mother's tired voice crackled through the speaker. Oh, sweetheart, I didn't want to worry you, but... She paused, and Sophie could hear the clink of dishes in the background. The foundation sent us another letter today. Sophie's stomach tightened. What did it say? They're being patient, thank goodness, but we still owe so much. Her mother's voice wavered. The loan helped us keep the garage open during COVID, but with business still slow. She trailed off, and Sophie could picture her mother's worried expression. How much is left to pay? Sophie asked, dreading the answer. Almost $40,000. Her mother's voice dropped to a whisper, as if saying it quietly would make the number smaller. Your father's working double shifts at the repair shop, and I picked up extra waitressing hours, but it's barely covering the minimum payments. Sophie's chest tightened. What about the payment plan they offered? We're trying, honey. The foundation's been understanding. They're good people, but with Sarah's college tuition coming up... Her mother's voice cracked. I don't know how we're going to manage it all. Sophie closed her eyes, fighting back tears. Maybe I can help. I'm making decent money now with this private nursing job. No, absolutely not, her mother cut in firmly. You're just starting your career. You need to focus on building your own life, not fixing our mistakes. But Mom? We'll figure something out, her mother insisted, though she didn't sound convinced. The foundation coordinator, Mrs. Thompson, said they might be able to extend the terms again. We just need to stay positive. After hanging up, Sophie sat in the darkness of her apartment, her mother's words echoing in her head. $40,000. The number seemed impossible, crushing. She thought about Caleb, about his foundation's work helping families like hers. The irony of caring for him while her family struggled with debt would have been funny if it wasn't so painful. The next morning, Sophie arrived at the mansion early, her steps heavy. She went through her morning routine mechanically, checking supplies, reviewing charts, preparing medications. When she heard Caleb's voice calling from his room, she hesitated. Sophie, is that you? Just a minute, she called back, her voice surprisingly steady. She busied herself organizing the medical cabinet, taking longer than necessary. When she finally entered his room, she kept her eyes focused on her tablet, avoiding his searching gaze. Good morning, Mr. Hawthorne. How are you feeling today? Back to Mr. Hawthorne, is it? She could hear the hint of concern in his voice. Sophie, is everything all right? Fine, she said quickly, perhaps too quickly. Just tired. Let's check your vitals. She moved through her tasks efficiently, maintaining professional distance. When Caleb tried to start a conversation about her family, she deflected with short answers and medical questions. The easy rapport they'd built felt suddenly fragile, weighted down by the secret pressure of her family's situation. How could she talk to him about anything when her family owed his foundation so much money? How could she look him in the eye, knowing they might default on their loan? The growing warmth between them felt tainted now, complicated by invisible strings of debt and obligation she hadn't even known existed. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the mansion's marble floors as Sophie finished changing Caleb's bandages. She'd maintained her professional distance all morning, speaking only when necessary about medical matters. Sophie, Caleb said softly, catching her wrist as she turned to leave. Would you join me in the garden? I think we need to talk. Her heart skipped a beat. I should really check on your medication schedule. Please. His voice was gentle but firm. The medications can wait a few minutes. Sophie nodded reluctantly, helping Caleb into his wheelchair. The garden path was smooth, winding through perfectly manicured rose bushes and flowering shrubs. The sweet scent of jasmine filled the air, but Sophie barely noticed it, her stomach churning with anxiety. Caleb directed them to a quiet corner with a stone bench beside a small fountain. The trickling water seemed too cheerful for the heaviness in Sophie's chest. I need to be honest with you, Caleb began, his hands folded in his lap. When you mentioned your family yesterday, something clicked. I had my assistant pull some records this morning. He paused, watching her carefully. Your parents took a loan from my foundation during the pandemic. Sophie's face burned. She stared at the ground, counting the pebbles in the path, anything to avoid looking at him. You knew? Not until today, he said quietly. The foundation handles thousands of cases. I don't typically review individual files. Sophie's hands trembled in her lap. I didn't know it was your foundation. I swear, when I took this job, Sophie, look at me. When she finally met his eyes, they were filled with understanding. I'm not upset. I'm telling you because I don't want this hanging between us. $40,000, she whispered, the number that had haunted her since her mother's call. That's not nothing, Mr. Hawthorne. We're back to Mr. Hawthorne again? He sighed. Your family needed help during a difficult time. That's exactly what my foundation exists for. But now I'm here, taking care of you, and my family owes you all this money? She stood up, pacing beside the fountain. Don't you see how complicated this makes everything? Only if we let it, Caleb said. Your professional capabilities and our connection have nothing to do with your family's loan. Sophie wrapped her arms around herself, feeling exposed. How can you say that? Every time you look at me now, you'll think about that debt. Every kind word, every moment we've shared. How do I know it's not just pity? Is that what you think of me? Caleb's voice held a note of hurt. That I'd play with your feelings because of a loan? I don't know what to think anymore. Sophie's voice cracked. Yesterday, everything felt so clear. Now. She gestured helplessly. Now I'm standing here wondering if I should even keep this job. If it's appropriate. If anything between us can be real with this hanging over us. Sophie. My family is struggling to make payments, she cut in, the words tumbling out. They're working extra shifts, barely keeping up. How can I sit here in this beautiful garden with you, knowing that? How can I trust my own feelings when I'm indebted to you? The fountain bubbled cheerfully beside them, a stark contrast to the tension in the air. Sophie felt tears threatening and blinked them back furiously. Everything she'd started to feel for Caleb, The warmth, the connection, the possibility of something more, now seemed tangled up in dollar signs and obligations. Caleb wheeled himself closer to the fountain, his shoulders tense. "There's something else I need to tell you, Sophie. Something I haven't shared with anyone else yet." Sophie wiped her eyes, forcing herself to focus. Despite her inner turmoil about the debt, she couldn't ignore the strain in his voice. "My company." He paused, running a hand through his dark hair. "We're on the brink of bankruptcy. The time I spent in the coma, things fell apart faster than anyone could have predicted." Sophie's eyes widened. "But you're Caleb Hawthorne. Your company is worth billions." "Was worth billions," he corrected, his voice heavy. "The market crashed while I was unconscious. Bad investments, mismanagement by the interim board, and a few calculated moves by our competitors." He laughed bitterly. 3 months in a coma was all it took to destroy everything I spent 15 years building." Sophie sank back onto the stone bench, trying to process this revelation. "There must be something you can do." "There is." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Margaret Chen." "Who?" "The daughter of Chen Industries' CEO. Their company has been trying to acquire mine for years." He turned to face Sophie fully. "Her father has offered a deal. If I marry Margaret, they'll inject enough capital to save my company. A merger through marriage, essentially." Sophie felt as if all the air had been knocked from her lungs. "Marriage? But that's archaic? Manipulative? Trust me, I know." Caleb's fingers drummed against his wheelchair armrest. "But it would save thousands of jobs. All the charitable foundations, including the one your family borrowed from, they'd be protected." Sophie stood up abruptly, needing to move. The perfectly manicured garden suddenly felt suffocating. "Why are you telling me this?" Caleb reached for her hand, and she let him take it, despite her confusion. "Because I need your help, Sophie. The Chens are traditional. They won't accept a quick business marriage. They want to see a proper courtship, but—" He hesitated. "Margaret is already involved with someone else. She's as reluctant about this arrangement as I am." "I don't understand what this has to do with me." "The Chens are coming to visit next week. If they see me already in a relationship with you, it could give us leverage. Force them to offer better terms. Maybe even find another solution." His grip on her hand tightened. "I know it's asking a lot, especially after what you just learned about your family's loan, but I need someone I can trust. Someone who understands what's at stake." Sophie pulled her hand away, wrapping her arms around herself. "You want me to pretend to be your girlfriend? To manipulate another company?" "When you put it that way, it sounds terrible," Caleb admitted. "But this isn't just about me or my company. It's about all the employees, the foundations, the charitable works, everything I've built that actually matters. And what happens when they discover the truth? That your nurse is playing dress-up as your girlfriend?" Sophie's voice trembled. "That my family owes you money?" "They won't. We'll be careful. Professional when needed, convincing when required." He looked up at her pleadingly. "I wouldn't ask if I had any other choice, Sophie. Will you help me?" Sophie stared at the fountain, watching water cascade over smooth stones. The request seemed impossible, unethical even. Yet she couldn't ignore the desperation in Caleb's voice, or the thousands of people who would be affected if his company failed, including her own family. Sophie sank back onto the garden bench, her mind racing. The weight of everything, her family's debt, Caleb's struggling company, and now this elaborate plan, pressed down on her shoulders. But as she looked at Caleb's worried face, she couldn't bring herself to say no. "All right," she said softly. "I'll help you." Relief flooded Caleb's features. "Thank you, Sophie. I know this isn't ideal." "We need ground rules," she interrupted, straightening her nurse's uniform. "I'm still your caregiver first, That can't change. Caleb nodded seriously. Of course, your professional reputation matters to me. And we need a story, how we met, when things changed between us. Sophie's practical nature took over, helping her push aside her conflicted emotions. It can't just be that you woke up and fell in love with your nurse. That's too obvious. What if we knew each other before? Caleb suggested, wheeling closer. I often visited the hospital where you worked for charity events. We could say we met there, had a few conversations that stayed with me. Sophie found herself warming to the idea. And then when you needed care, you specifically requested me because you remembered our connection. Exactly. Caleb smiled, and Sophie's heart skipped despite herself. Then during my recovery, those old feelings deepened into something more. That's actually believable, Sophie admitted. She pulled out her phone and started making notes. We should write down the details, make sure our stories match. They spent the next hour crafting their fictional romance, filling it with small, realistic touches. Sophie suggested including their shared interest in healthcare charity work. Caleb added details about casual conversations over coffee in the hospital cafeteria. The Chens will want to know about our families, Caleb mentioned carefully. How should we handle that? Sophie tensed. We tell as much truth as possible. My family doesn't know about us yet because everything happened so quickly. We're planning to tell them soon. And the loan? We leave that out entirely, Sophie said firmly. It has nothing to do with our relationship. Caleb reached for her hand, and this time she didn't pull away. I want you to know that I plan to help your family, regardless of how this plays out. The loan terms were predatory. That happened while I was in the coma. We'll figure something out. Sophie felt tears prick at her eyes. Thank you, she whispered. But right now, let's focus on saving your company. They continued planning until the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the garden. Sophie glanced at her watch, realizing it was time for her evening rounds. I should get your evening medications ready, she said, standing up. We can talk more about this tomorrow. Caleb caught her wrist gently. Sophie, thank you again. Not just for this, but for everything. Having you here, it means more than you know. Sophie felt warmth spread through her chest as she gathered her things. As she moved around Caleb's room, preparing his evening routine, she could feel his eyes following her. When she glanced up, she caught him watching her with a tender expression that made her breath catch. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it would be like if this wasn't just pretend, if the soft looks and gentle touches were real. But she quickly pushed the thought away. She couldn't afford to blur the lines between reality and fiction, not when so much was at stake. The morning sun filtered through the mansion's tall windows as Sophie helped Caleb with his physical therapy exercises. Their new routine had developed naturally over the past few days. Morning exercises, followed by breakfast on the terrace, then hours of preparation for their upcoming public appearance as a couple. You're getting stronger, Sophie noted, supporting his arm as he completed another set of movements. Your recovery is progressing faster than expected. Caleb smiled, a light sheen of sweat on his forehead. I have excellent motivation, and an even better nurse. Sophie felt her cheeks warm at the compliment. These moments had become increasingly common, small exchanges that felt more genuine than their practiced responses for the public. After the exercises, they settled on the terrace with coffee and fresh pastries. The garden stretched out before them, spring flowers painting the landscape in vibrant colors. Tell me about growing up, Sophie said, stirring her coffee. What was little Caleb Hawthorne like? His eyes grew distant, a soft smile playing on his lips. I was the quiet kid with big dreams. My father worked 2 jobs, and my mother taught piano lessons from our tiny apartment. We didn't have much, but they made sure I never felt poor. That must have shaped your charitable work, Sophie observed. It did. Caleb nodded, his expression thoughtful. I remember watching my parents struggle to pay medical bills when my sister got sick. That's why healthcare became my focus. Nobody should have to choose between medication and food. Sophie's heart ached at the rawness in his voice. What happened to your sister? She recovered, thankfully, but those months changed me. He met Sophie's eyes. I promised myself that if I ever had the means, I'd help others avoid that struggle. And you did, Sophie said softly. Your foundation has helped countless families. Until I ended up in a coma and others took advantage. His hands tightened around his coffee cup. Sometimes I wonder if I was naive, thinking I could change the world. Sophie reached across the table, touching his arm. You weren't naive. You were hopeful. The world needs more of that, not less. Caleb covered her hand with his. How do you do that? Do what? See the best in everything. In me. His voice was barely above a whisper. Sophie felt her pulse quicken. I just see you, Caleb. Not the billionaire, not the philanthropist. Just you. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the morning breeze carrying the scent of blooming flowers. Caleb began sharing more stories, about his first business venture selling homemade software in college, about the mentor who believed in him when no one else did, about his fears of failing now when so many people depended on him. Sophie listened, occasionally asking questions, but mostly just taking in this unguarded version of him. She found herself sharing, too, about her childhood dreams of becoming a nurse, about the satisfaction she felt helping others heal, about her own fears and hopes. The morning slipped away as they talked, their pretense of preparation for their public engagement forgotten. In these quiet moments, Sophie felt herself drawn to the real Caleb, the man behind the business empire, who still carried the dreams of that quiet kid from a tiny apartment. As their conversation reached a natural pause, Caleb took her hand again, squeezing it gently. The gesture was different from their practiced touches for their charade. It felt genuine, warm, full of unspoken meaning. Sophie felt her heart flutter, and a question rose in her mind. Was this still just a business arrangement, or had it become something more? Sophie's phone buzzed insistently as she organized Caleb's medications in the quiet solitude of the mansion's kitchen. Her mother's name flashed across the screen, making her stomach twist with anxiety. Taking a deep breath, she answered. Sophie, honey, I'm so sorry to bother you at work. Her mother's voice trembled. But we just got another notice about the loan payment. They're threatening to take legal action if we don't make a payment by the end of the month. Sophie's hand gripped the counter, her knuckles turning white. How much do they need, Mom? 5,000. Her mother's voice cracked. I wouldn't ask if we had any other option. Your father's overtime got cut back, and with Tommy's college tuition due. Sophie closed her eyes, fighting back tears. The amount might as well have been 5 million. Her savings were practically non-existent after helping with last month's payment. I'll figure something out, Mom. Just give me a few days. You're an angel, sweetheart. I don't know what we'd do without you. After hanging up, Sophie slumped against the counter, her chest tight with anxiety. The irony of her situation wasn't lost on her. Standing in a billion-dollar mansion, yet unable to help her family with a few $1,000s. She could practically feel the walls closing in. What am I supposed to do? She whispered to herself, running her hands through her hair. The weight of her family's debt, her growing feelings for Caleb, and their complicated arrangement felt like a tangled mess she couldn't possibly unravel. She thought about telling her family about Caleb, about his connection to their debt, about their arrangement. But how could she explain any of it? Oh, by the way, Mom, I'm pretending to be engaged to the man whose charity we owe money to, and I might actually be falling for him." A quiet sob escaped her throat as she pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to hold back tears. The sound of her phone clattering to the floor echoed through the kitchen. "Sophie?" She spun around to find Caleb standing in the doorway, concern etched across his face. He'd been getting better at moving around on his own, though he still needed his cane for support. "I'm fine," she said quickly, wiping her eyes. "Just a family thing. Nothing important." Caleb's expression softened as he made his way to her. "Your mother called about the debt, didn't she?" Sophie nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "They need help with another payment. I feel so helpless. I can't even tell them about—" She gestured vaguely between them. "Hey," Caleb said gently, reaching out to squeeze her hand. "Everything will work out, I promise." His smile was reassuring, warm and genuine. Everything she'd come to expect from him. But despite his comforting words, Sophie couldn't shake the knot of dread in her stomach. There were too many variables, too many ways this could all fall apart. The fake engagement, her family's debt, her real feelings for Caleb. It felt like a house of cards that could collapse at any moment. She managed a weak smile in return, but inside, her mind was racing with all the ways their carefully constructed plan could unravel. Still, she didn't voice these concerns, didn't want to burden him with more worry when he already had so much on his plate. Sophie smoothed her navy blue dress nervously as she sat beside Caleb in the opulent conference room. The wall-to-wall windows offered a stunning view of the city skyline, but she barely noticed it. Her attention was fixed on the three stern-faced executives from Rivera Corp. Seated across the polished mahogany table. Mr. Rivera himself, a silver-haired man with sharp eyes, studied them intently. "Mr. Hawthorne, we appreciate you meeting with us so soon after your recovery." "Of course," Caleb replied smoothly, his hand finding Sophie's under the table. His touch steadied her racing heart. "I wouldn't dream of delaying such an important discussion." "And this is your—" Mr. Rivera's gaze shifted to Sophie, his eyebrow raising slightly. "My fiancé," Caleb said, his voice warm with affection that sounded genuine even to Sophie's ears. "Sophie has been instrumental in my recovery." The youngest executive, a woman in her 30s, leaned forward. "How fortunate that you found love during such a difficult time." Her tone carried a hint of skepticism that made Sophie's cheeks burn. Caleb's thumb traced gentle circles on Sophie's palm. "Sometimes life's greatest gifts come when we least expect them." The meeting progressed into discussions of market shares and profit margins. Sophie stayed quiet, trying to project the calm confidence of someone who belonged in this world of high-stakes business. She noticed how Caleb never wavered, his responses measured and diplomatic, even when Mr. Rivera made thinly veiled threats about hostile takeovers. "Your company's position is precarious," Mr. Rivera said, shuffling through some papers. "Our offer of a merger through marriage with my daughter still stands. It would be the most stable solution." Sophie's stomach clenched, but Caleb's grip on her hand remained steady. "I appreciate the offer, but as I've mentioned, I'm happily engaged." He smiled at Sophie with such tenderness that her heart skipped a beat. "Some things are worth more than business arrangements." The meeting ended with tentative agreements to continue discussions, but the tension lingered in the air as the Rivera executives filed out. As soon as the door closed behind them, Sophie let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "You were amazing," Caleb said softly, turning to face her. They were alone in the conference room now, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the floor. "I don't know how I would have gotten through that without you." I barely said anything, Sophie admitted, looking down at their still joined hands. Your presence alone gave me strength. Caleb reached up with his free hand, gently tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. You ground me, Sophie. You make me want to be better. The tenderness in his voice made her look up, and what she saw in his eyes took her breath away. There was no pretense there, no act for the benefit of others, just raw emotion that made her heart race. For a moment they sat in silence, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. Sophie felt herself being pulled toward him like a magnet, even as her mind raced with doubts. How could this work? Their worlds were so different. The weight of her family's debt, the pressure of their arrangement, the expectations of society. It all seemed insurmountable. Yet as Caleb looked at her with those sincere eyes, Sophie felt herself falling deeper, despite all her reservations. Her heart fluttered with equal parts hope and fear, knowing that what she felt for him was becoming more real with each passing day. The evening sun cast long shadows through the mansion's windows as Sophie organized Caleb's medications. The quiet routine helped calm her nerves after the intense meeting earlier. She could still feel the weight of Mr. Rivera's suspicious stares, the pressure of maintaining their facade. The sharp ring of Caleb's phone cut through the silence. From her position near the doorway to his study, Sophie heard his voice shift from professional to tense in seconds. Mr. Rivera, I wasn't expecting to hear from you so soon. Caleb's tone was controlled, but Sophie detected an edge of concern that made her pause. She knew she shouldn't eavesdrop, but something in Caleb's voice kept her rooted to the spot. Through the partially open door, she could see him pacing, one hand running through his dark hair. I assure you, my engagement to Sophie is genuine, Caleb said firmly, but Mr. Rivera's response made him stop in his tracks. Sophie's heart pounded as she listened to the one-sided conversation. The medication tray trembled slightly in her hands. Are you threatening me? Caleb's voice had dropped dangerously low. Because I wouldn't advise... He fell silent, listening intently. I see. Caleb's jaw clenched. And what makes you think the engagement isn't real? Sophie held her breath, straining to hear Mr. Rivera's response, but his words were just a muffled buzz through the phone. Listen carefully, Caleb said, his voice tight with controlled anger. If you or your people come anywhere near Sophie or try to investigate our relationship, you'll regret it. This isn't just about business anymore. There was another pause, and Sophie watched Caleb's knuckles turn white as he gripped the phone. You're right about one thing, he continued. If this engagement isn't real, everything could fall apart. My company, my reputation, everything I've built. But you're wrong if you think that means you have leverage over me. Sophie's hands shook so badly she had to set the medication tray down on a nearby table. The weight of what she was hearing pressed down on her chest. Everything Caleb had worked for hung in the balance, and she was at the center of it all. Caleb ended the call and turned toward the door, freezing when he saw Sophie standing there. Their eyes met, and Sophie saw the worry in his expression before he could mask it. How much did you hear? He asked softly, crossing the room to her. Enough, Sophie whispered, wrapping her arms around herself. Caleb, if they prove our engagement isn't real, they won't, he said firmly, reaching for her hands. Sophie, look at me. She raised her eyes to meet his, seeing determination mixed with something deeper, something that made her heart race. I'll do whatever it takes to make this work, he promised, squeezing her hands gently. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. But as Sophie looked into his eyes, doubt crept in like a shadow. Was she just a convenient solution to his problems? A pawn in this high-stakes game of corporate chess? Her heart wanted to believe in the tenderness she saw in his gaze, but her mind couldn't shake the fear that she was in over her head. "Everything you've worked for is at risk," she said quietly. "Your whole future depends on making this look real." "Sophie," Caleb started, but she pulled her hands away gently. "I just need some time to think," she said, stepping back. The space between them felt like a chasm, filled with unspoken words and growing uncertainty. The morning newspaper landed on Caleb's desk with a dull thud. Sophie watched his face darken as he scanned the headlines. The stock market had plummeted overnight, and his company's shares had taken the worst hit. 28%, Caleb muttered, running his hands through his disheveled hair. "We lost 28% of our value in a single day." Sophie stood quietly beside him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. The morning sun, streaming through the study windows, seemed to mock the gravity of the situation. "Maybe it'll bounce back," she offered softly, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her uncertainty. Caleb shook his head, pushing away from his desk. "This isn't just a bad day, Sophie. This is—" He trailed off, walking to the window. "This is what Rivera was waiting for. He knew this was coming." Sophie watched as Caleb's shoulders slumped, a posture so different from his usual confident stance. The phone on his desk hadn't stopped ringing all morning, but he'd ignored every call. "What can I do?" she asked, feeling helpless in the face of his distress. "You're already doing it," he said, turning to face her with tired eyes. "Just being here. It helps more than you know." But Sophie could see the weight crushing him. His tablet constantly buzzed with notifications. More bad news, more problems, more pressure. She picked it up, scanning the latest updates. "The board wants an emergency meeting," she read aloud, her stomach tightening. "They're questioning your leadership after the coma." Caleb laughed bitterly. "Of course they are. First Rivera threatens our engagement, now this." He walked to the small bar cart in the corner and poured himself a glass of water, his hands shaking slightly. "Everything I've built, everything I've worked for, it's slipping through my fingers." Sophie felt her own anxiety rising. She'd grown to care deeply for Caleb over these past weeks, and watching him struggle tore at her heart. But the magnitude of his problems seemed overwhelming. What could she, a simple nurse, possibly do to help save $1 billion empire? "You're not alone in this," she said, moving to stand beside him. "We can figure something out." Caleb turned to her, his eyes softening. "Sophie, you've already done so much, more than I had any right to ask." He reached out, touching her cheek gently. "But this might be too big for both of us." The intimacy of the moment was broken by another call. Caleb glanced at his phone and grimaced. The board again. Sophie stepped back, suddenly feeling the weight of everything pressing down on her. The fake engagement, her family's debt, Caleb's crumbling empire, and her growing feelings for him. It was all becoming too much. "I need some air," she whispered, walking towards the French doors that led to the garden. Outside, the morning air was crisp and clean. Sophie moved to the stone railing, gripping it tightly as she looked out over the perfectly manicured roses. The garden had always seemed like a sanctuary, but today even its beauty couldn't calm the storm in her heart. She watched a butterfly land on a nearby bloom, its wings catching the sunlight. How could something so delicate navigate such strong winds? The same question echoed in her mind about herself and Caleb. His world was falling apart, and she wondered if her presence in his life was helping or just adding to his complications. Behind her, she could hear Caleb's muffled voice as he finally took the board's call. The sound made her chest tighten. Some problems, she realized, might be too big for love alone to solve. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight, its deep chimes echoing through the quiet mansion. Sophie sat in the library's window seat, watching the moonlight dance on the garden fountain below. She couldn't sleep, her mind too full of worries about Caleb, his company, and their complicated situation. "Can't sleep either?" Caleb's soft voice startled her from her thoughts. She turned to find him standing in the doorway, still in his day clothes, looking as restless as she felt. His tie was loose, and his usually perfect hair was slightly disheveled. "Too many thoughts," she admitted, making room for him on the window seat. He sat beside her, close enough that she could smell his familiar cologne. For a moment, they both watched the fountain in comfortable silence. "I've been thinking," Caleb said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "about everything that's happened since I woke up from the coma." Sophie turned to face him, drawing her knees up to her chest. The moonlight softened his features, making him look younger, more vulnerable. "These past few weeks," he continued, "with the company struggling and Rivera breathing down my neck, I should be completely falling apart." He reached for her hand, his touch gentle. "But somehow I'm not. And it's because of you, Sophie." Her heart skipped a beat. "Caleb, when I'm lost in the numbers and the threats and the pressure," he said, his thumb tracing circles on her palm, "you're my anchor. You remind me what's real." Sophie felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. "I'm just trying to help." "It's more than that." He shifted closer. "When I first woke up and kissed you, I thought it was just confusion from the coma. But now I know it was something else. Something real." The confession hung in the air between them. Sophie's heart hammered in her chest as she gathered her courage. "I think I'm falling in love with you," she whispered, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "And it terrifies me." Caleb's hand tightened around hers. "Why does it terrify you?" "Because this started as pretend. Because my family owes you money. Because your company needs you to marry someone else." She took a shaky breath. "Because I don't belong in your world." "Sophie." He reached up with his free hand to cup her cheek. "You're the only real thing in my world right now. But the complications are huge," he acknowledged. "The debt, Rivera, the company, they're all very real problems." His eyes held hers steadily. "But so is this connection between us." Sophie leaned into his touch, unable to deny the truth of his words. The fake engagement might have brought them together, but what had grown between them was genuine. "I don't know how to reconcile all of this," she admitted. "Neither do I," Caleb said softly. "But I know that when I'm with you, everything else makes more sense." In the quiet of the library, with moonlight streaming through the windows and the fountain's gentle music floating up from the garden, Sophie felt the walls she'd built around her heart crumbling. Caleb leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to. She didn't. His lips met hers in a kiss that was nothing like their first one. This wasn't born of confusion or impulse. It was tender, deliberate, full of everything they'd just confessed. Sophie's hands found their way to his shoulders as she kissed him back, knowing that this moment of perfect understanding couldn't last forever. They both knew that tomorrow would bring more complications, more decisions, more impossible choices. Their fake engagement couldn't continue indefinitely, and the real world waited just outside the library doors. But for now, in this midnight moment, they allowed themselves to simply be. Sophie's hands trembled as she watched the news broadcast on the massive TV in Caleb's study. Richard Rivera, CEO of Rivera Enterprises, stood at a podium addressing a crowd of reporters, his steel-gray hair gleaming under the camera lights. "The future of both our companies depends on this merger. Rivera announced, his voice carrying authority that made Sophie's stomach twist. And to ensure the lasting success of this partnership, we propose a traditional alliance through marriage. My daughter Victoria and Mr. Hawthorne would make an excellent match, both personally and professionally. Caleb sat beside Sophie on the leather couch, his jaw clenched tight. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from board members and shareholders, but he ignored them all. "He's forcing my hand," Caleb muttered, running his fingers through his hair. "Making it public like this. He knows exactly what he's doing." Sophie wrapped her arms around herself, feeling smaller by the minute. The weight of their pretense pressed down on her shoulders like a heavy blanket. "Your shareholders will expect you to accept," she said quietly. "I don't care what they expect." Caleb turned to face her, his eyes intense. "We'll find another way. I can arrange different financing, restructure the debt." "Stop!" Sophie interrupted, standing up. She couldn't bear to watch him scramble for solutions that didn't exist. "We both know this isn't just about money anymore. Rivera's made it personal." The study felt too small suddenly, too confined. Sophie walked to the window, watching raindrops trace patterns on the glass. Behind her, she heard Caleb rise from the couch. "I won't let him dictate my future," he said firmly. "Our future." The word "our" made Sophie's heart ache. She turned back to face him, taking in his determined expression, the way his hands were clenched at his sides. He looked every bit the powerful businessman he was, but she could see the vulnerability in his eyes. "Your company employs thousands of people," she said softly. "Their livelihoods depend on you making the right choice." "And what about us?" Caleb stepped closer. "What about everything we talked about last night?" Sophie felt tears threatening to spill. "Last night was—" She swallowed hard. "Beautiful. But this morning, reality is staring us in the face." Another buzz from Caleb's phone filled the silence between them. On the TV, reporters were still dissecting Rivera's announcement, showing split-screen images of Caleb and Victoria Rivera. "I can't keep pretending," Sophie finally said, her voice breaking. "I can't stand in front of cameras and act like I belong in your world when we both know I don't. I'm a nurse from a family that owes you money, and Victoria Rivera is—" She gestured helplessly at the screen. "Sophie, please." "No," she cut him off, wiping at her eyes. "I need to step away from this plan. The truth will only hurt more people if we keep going. Your employees, your shareholders, my family." She took a deep breath. Sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest. Caleb reached for her hand, but Sophie stepped back. Each inch of distance between them felt like a mile, but she knew it was necessary. "I care about you too much to watch you lose everything," she whispered. "And I care about myself too much to keep pretending I can be someone I'm not." "Sophie, wait." Caleb's voice cracked with emotion as he crossed the study in quick strides. "We can figure this out together. I've faced worse challenges in business before." Sophie paused at the doorway, her hand resting on the ornate wooden frame. The familiar scent of leather and old books filled her nose as she turned back to face him. His usually confident demeanor had given way to something more vulnerable, more raw. "Have you?" she asked softly. "Have you really faced worse than this? Your entire company is at stake, Caleb. Everything you've built." He ran his fingers through his hair, messing up his usually perfect style. "The company isn't everything. I've learned that during my time in the Coma, during my time with you." Rain continued to drum against the windows, creating a melancholic backdrop to their conversation. Sophie wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold herself together. "I can restructure the debt," Caleb continued, his words coming faster now. "I have connections, other investors who might be interested. Rivera isn't the only option." "But he's the best option," Sophie pointed out. "That's why this is happening in the first place." Caleb stepped closer, close enough that Sophie could see the tiny flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "I don't care if he's the best option for the business. I care about what's best for us." "Us," Sophie repeated, the word tasting bittersweet on her tongue. "Caleb, I don't even know what us means anymore. Are we real? Are we pretending? Everything's gotten so mixed up." "I know how I feel about you," he said firmly. "That's not pretend." Sophie felt tears welling up again. "But how can we know for sure? This whole situation, it's like we're living in a bubble. The pressure, the secrets, my family's debt to your foundation." She took a shaky breath. "I need to think clearly, and I can't do that here." "Tell me what you need," Caleb pleaded. "Whatever it is, I'll make it happen." "I need space," Sophie whispered, the words hurting her throat as they came out. "I need time to figure out what's real and what isn't. What's best for everyone involved, not just us." Caleb's face fell, but he nodded slowly. "How long?" "I don't know," she admitted. "Long enough to sort through my feelings without all this chaos around us. Long enough to know if what I feel for you is real or if it's just circumstance." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words and emotions. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. "I'll have Margaret cover your shifts," Caleb finally said, his voice tight with control. "Take whatever time you need." Sophie nodded, grateful for his understanding even as her heart ached. She took a step back, then another, creating physical distance to match the emotional space she needed. "Thank you," she whispered, "for understanding." She turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. Each step felt like lead, but she forced herself to keep moving. Behind her, she heard Caleb's phone buzzing again, reminding her of all the pressures and complications that had led to this moment. As she reached the front door, Sophie paused for just a moment, her hand on the handle. The mansion that had become so familiar now felt strange again, like it had on her first day. She stepped out into the rain, letting the cold drops mix with her tears as she walked to her car, knowing that nothing would be the same after today. Sophie sat in her tiny apartment, staring at the rain trickling down her window. 3 days had passed since she'd left the mansion, but her mind kept wandering back to Caleb. Her small coffee table was covered with unopened bills, and her half-drunk tea had long gone cold. She picked up her phone for the 100th time, scrolling through photos from their time together. There was one of them in the garden. Caleb's smile genuine and warm as he showed her his prized roses. Another captured a quiet moment during his physical therapy, his determination evident even through the screen. "What am I doing?" she whispered to herself, setting the phone down. Her mother had called twice today, worried about the mounting debt, but Sophie had let it go to voicemail. She needed clarity, and family pressure wouldn't help her find it. Standing up, Sophie walked to her bedroom mirror. Dark circles shadowed her eyes from sleepless nights spent thinking about Caleb. She touched her reflection, remembering how it felt when he'd first kissed her, still groggy from his coma. That hadn't been planned or calculated. It had been pure instinct. She thought about their late-night conversations, the way he'd opened up about his fears and dreams, the vulnerability in his voice when he talked about losing everything, the gentle way he'd held her hand during difficult moments. None of that had been fake. Moving to her window, Sophie watched people hurrying through the rain below. A young couple shared an umbrella, laughing as they dodged puddles. The sight made her heart ache. "Love isn't perfect," she said aloud, her breath fogging the glass. "It's messy and complicated." She thought about how Caleb had handled learning about her family's debt, with understanding and compassion, never once holding it against her. How he'd shared his own struggles and fears, trusting her with his vulnerabilities. Walking back to her couch, Sophie picked up an old photo of her family. They were smiling, unaware of the financial troubles that would come. Caleb's foundation had helped them when they needed it most, even if they didn't know it was him. That was the kind of man he was, helping others without seeking recognition. The rain outside intensified, drumming against her windows. Sophie closed her eyes, listening to its rhythm. Every beat seemed to whisper Caleb's name, reminding her of what she was letting slip away. Her heart raced as clarity finally washed over her. The complications, the business pressures, her family's debt, they were all just circumstances. But what she felt for Caleb, that was real. That was worth fighting for. Sophie grabbed her keys and purse, not even bothering with an umbrella. The drive to the mansion seemed both eternal and too quick. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as streetlights blurred past through the rain-streaked windshield. Pulling up to the familiar gates, Sophie felt a surge of certainty. She didn't care about the rival company's threats or the complexity of their situation. What mattered was that she loved Caleb, and she knew he loved her too. The mansion loomed before her, its windows glowing warmly against the stormy evening. Sophie parked her car and stepped out into the rain, her heart pounding but her mind clear. She was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, as long as they faced them together. The grand conference room buzzed with tension as investors and staff members filled every seat. Mahogany panels lined the walls, and floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the city skyline beyond. Sophie stood near the back, her hands clasped tightly together as Caleb took his place at the head of the long table. He looked different today, stronger, more determined. His navy suit was crisp, his posture commanding. The lingering weakness from his coma had been replaced by an air of quiet confidence that made Sophie's heart skip. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Caleb began, his voice clear and steady. "I know there have been many rumors about the future of Hawthorne Industries, particularly regarding a potential merger through marriage." Murmurs rippled through the room. Sophie noticed several board members exchange worried glances. "I want to be clear," Caleb continued, standing taller. "I will not be pursuing that option. I will not marry anyone's daughter to secure a business deal." The murmurs grew louder. An older investor near the front stood up, his face red. "Mr. Hawthorne, you can't be serious. The company needs this merger to survive." Caleb raised his hand, silencing the protests. "What this company needs is to return to its roots. We built Hawthorne Industries on innovation and integrity, not manipulation and forced arrangements." He pressed a button, and the screen behind him lit up with figures and graphs. "Over the past decade, our philanthropic initiatives have created partnerships with over 200 charitable organizations worldwide. These connections represent not just goodwill, but untapped potential." Sophie watched as Caleb moved around the table, engaging with each person directly. His passion was evident in every gesture, every word. This was the man she'd gotten to know during their quiet conversations, the one who cared more about helping others than amassing wealth. "I've spoken with our philanthropic partners," he explained, "and many are willing to invest in our future. They believe in our mission and our potential. Together we can secure the funding we need while maintaining our independence and our values." The room grew quieter as he laid out his plan. Sophie could see the skepticism on some faces slowly transform into consideration, then interest. Caleb's enthusiasm was infectious, his vision compelling. "We don't need to sacrifice our principles for profit," he declared. "We can build something stronger by staying true to who we are." From her position near the back, Sophie felt pride swell in her chest. This was Caleb at his best. Not a desperate businessman willing to trade his happiness for security, but a leader with conviction and heart. An elderly board member slowly stood up, "It's risky, Hawthorne," she said, adjusting her glasses. "But it's the kind of risk that built this company in the first place." Others began nodding in agreement. Sophie watched as more people voiced their support. Caleb's eyes met hers across the room, and in that moment, she saw everything she loved about him. His strength, his integrity, his unwavering determination to do what was right. He wasn't just a wealthy man in an expensive suit making business decisions. He was someone who fought for his beliefs, who chose the harder path because it was the right one. As the meeting continued around her, Sophie realized that this was the man she'd fallen in love with. Not his money or his status, but his heart. After the meeting, Sophie found Caleb in his study, surrounded by stacks of papers and financial reports. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow across the room. He looked up as she entered, a gentle smile crossing his face. "That was incredible," Sophie said, moving closer to his desk. "What you did in there?" "I couldn't have done it without you," Caleb replied, standing up. He walked around the desk, taking her hands in his. "Your support gave me the courage to make the right choice." Sophie squeezed his hands, feeling the warmth of his touch. "I'm just glad you found a way to save the company without compromising who you are." Caleb's expression shifted, becoming more serious. "There's something else I need to tell you, Sophie." He guided her to sit in one of the leather armchairs by the fireplace. "It's about your family's debt." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. The weight of her family's financial burden had been a constant shadow over her happiness. "I've been helping your family pay off their debt," Caleb said softly. "Not just recently, but for the past few months." Sophie's eyes widened. "What? But how?" "I arranged it through the foundation," he explained. "Anonymous monthly contributions to reduce the principal. Your family's dedication to making payments, even when times were tough, showed me their integrity. I wanted to help, but I knew they wouldn't accept direct assistance." Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes as the magnitude of his kindness hit her. All this time, while she'd been worried about her family's struggles, Caleb had been quietly helping them. "The debt is nearly cleared now," he continued, reaching out to wipe away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "I wanted to tell you sooner, but with everything happening with the company..." Sophie launched herself forward, wrapping her arms around him in a tight embrace. "Thank you," she whispered against his shoulder. "You have no idea what this means to my family." Caleb held her close, his hand running soothingly along her back. "Your family's determination to honor their commitments, even when it seemed impossible, that's the kind of integrity I want to support." Later that evening, Sophie's family arrived at the mansion. Her mother's eyes were red from crying happy tears, and her father seemed overwhelmed with emotion. They gathered in the living room, where Caleb explained everything. "Mr. Hawthorne," Sophie's father began, his voice thick with emotion, "we can never repay your kindness." "You already have," Caleb replied warmly, "by raising a daughter like Sophie. She's shown me what true compassion and dedication look like." Sophie's mother reached out and took Caleb's hand. "You've given us back our peace of mind. We've been so worried about burdening Sophie with our problems." "Your family's strength and unity inspired me," Caleb said, glancing at Sophie with affection. "Sometimes the greatest wealth isn't in money, but in the bonds we share with those we love." Sophie watched as her family embraced Caleb, accepting him not as a wealthy benefactor, but as someone who truly cared about their well-being. The burden that had weighed so heavily on her heart lifted, replaced by a warmth that spread through her entire being. In this moment, surrounded by the people she loved most in the world, Sophie felt a deep sense of peace and possibility for the future. Sophie stood by the window in Caleb's study, her hands trembling as she held the threatening letter from his rival, Maxwell Brunswick. The morning sun cast long shadows across the hardwood floor, but the warmth couldn't reach the cold dread in her heart. "He's going to expose everything about my family's debt," she whispered, her voice breaking. "The media will have a field day. My parents, they'll be humiliated." Caleb crossed the room, his footsteps heavy with determination. "Sophie, look at me." He gently took the letter from her hands and set it aside. "Brunswick is desperate. He's trying to force my hand because he knows his daughter doesn't want this marriage any more than I do." "But he has proof, Caleb. All the loan documents, the payment history." Sophie turned away, wrapping her arms around herself. "I can't let my family go through that kind of public shame. Maybe it would be better if I just stepped aside." "No." Caleb's voice was firm but gentle. "I won't let you sacrifice your happiness because of his threats. What choice do we have?" Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "He's given you until tomorrow to announce the engagement to his daughter. If you don't, then let him do his worst." Caleb took her hands in his. "Sophie, I've spent my entire life building businesses, making deals, and trying to please everyone else. But loving you, that's the first thing that's felt truly right." Sophie looked up at him, seeing the resolve in his eyes. "But your company is nothing compared to what we have." He reached up to wipe away a tear from her cheek. "Besides, Brunswick isn't the only one with influence in this city." Just then, Caleb's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and a small smile crossed his face. "Perfect timing. My lawyers just confirmed something." He walked to his desk and pressed the intercom. "Martha, could you send Mr. Brunswick up? I believe he's right on schedule." Sophie's heart raced. "He's here?" "I invited him." Caleb's voice was calm, confident. "It's time to end this." Minutes later, Maxwell Brunswick strode into the study, his expensive suit and perfectly coiffed hair a stark contrast to the anger in his eyes. "Have you made your decision, Hawthorne?" "I have." Caleb stood tall, positioning himself between Brunswick and Sophie. "I'm choosing love over manipulation. I'm choosing integrity over profit. And I'm choosing to forgive your attempts to destroy what matters most to me." Brunswick's face reddened. "You're making a mistake. Once this story hits the press—" "It won't," Caleb interrupted. "Because if you try to expose Sophie's family, you'll also have to explain why your company has been systematically overcharging charitable organizations for the past 5 years. My lawyers have all the documentation." Brunswick's confident facade cracked. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Caleb's voice remained steady. "I'm willing to let it all go. Your threats, your schemes, everything. In return, you'll leave Sophie's family alone and find a more honest way to run your business." The silence in the room was deafening. Finally, Brunswick's shoulders slumped slightly. "You've changed, Hawthorne. The old you would have made the deal. The old me didn't know what was truly worth fighting for." Caleb reached back and took Sophie's hand, squeezing it gently. Brunswick looked between them, then nodded curtly. "You'll have my withdrawal from the merger negotiations on your desk by morning." He turned and left without another word. Sophie released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Caleb." He turned to face her, his eyes soft with love. "No business deal, no amount of money, no external pressure could ever be worth losing you. I hope you know that." The grand ballroom of the Hawthorne estate sparkled with crystal chandeliers and elegant decorations. Reporters and business associates filled the space, their quiet murmurs creating a steady hum of anticipation. This press conference had been hastily arranged, but the turnout was impressive. Sophie stood backstage, smoothing her simple blue dress with trembling hands. "Are you sure about this?" she whispered to Caleb, who looked dashing in his charcoal suit. More sure than I've ever been about anything. He took her hand, his thumb gently caressing her palm. Ready? She nodded, drawing strength from his steady presence. Together they walked onto the small stage, camera flashes immediately lighting up their faces. Caleb approached the microphone, his posture confident but relaxed. Thank you all for coming today. I know there have been many rumors and speculations about recent events involving Hawthorne Industries and my personal life. The crowd fell silent, hanging on his every word. Sophie watched him, amazed by his natural grace under pressure. Some of you may have heard that I was planning to merge with Brunswick Corporation through an arranged marriage. He paused, his eyes finding Sophie's. Those rumors were partly true. I did consider it, believing it was the only way to save what I'd built. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Caleb continued, his voice growing stronger. But sometimes life has a way of showing us what truly matters. When I was in my coma, one person showed me genuine care and compassion, expecting nothing in return. That person is Sophie Marshall. Sophie's heart swelled as Caleb turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. Sophie came into my life as my nurse, but she became so much more. She showed me that true strength isn't about making deals or accumulating wealth. It's about having the courage to be vulnerable, to love honestly, and to stand up for what's right. Tears welled in Sophie's eyes as Caleb spoke directly to her now, seemingly forgetting the crowd. You never saw me as just a billionaire or a business opportunity. You saw me at my weakest and still chose to stand by my side. You taught me that real love isn't about convenience or advantage. It's about choosing each other, every day, no matter what. Sophie stepped forward to the microphone, her voice clear and steady despite her emotions. When I first walked into this mansion, I was just a nurse doing her job. I never expected to fall in love with my patient. She smiled at the soft laughter from the audience. But Caleb showed me that love doesn't care about social status or bank accounts. He's the most genuine, caring person I've ever known, and I'm proud to stand beside him as his equal. Caleb wrapped an arm around her waist, addressing the crowd once more. Today, we're announcing not just our relationship, but our commitment to creating a future together based on truth and genuine love. Hawthorne Industries will continue to thrive, not through corporate marriages or backdoor deals, but through honest business practices and a renewed commitment to helping others. The room erupted in applause, cameras flashing frantically. Sophie turned to Caleb, her eyes shining with joy and love. He pulled her close, cupping her face gently in his hands. I love you, Sophie Marshall, he whispered, just loud enough for her to hear. And I love you, Caleb Hawthorne, she replied, her heart soaring. Their lips met in a passionate kiss, the applause growing even louder. For that perfect moment, the world fell away. There were no cameras, no reporters, no business concerns. There was just them, their love, and the beautiful beginning of their story together. The autumn breeze rustled through the courtyard of Hawthorne Industries as Sophie walked through the newly renovated lobby. Employees greeted her warmly, not as the nurse who had cared for their boss during his coma, but as an integral part of the company's leadership. 3 months had passed since their public declaration of love, and the changes were remarkable. The stock prices had stabilized, and investors had responded positively to Caleb's honest approach to business. More importantly, they had expanded their charitable initiatives, focusing on helping families struggling with medical debt, a cause close to both their hearts. Sophie paused at her office door, running her fingers over the nameplate that read, Sophie Marshall, Director of Community Outreach. She smiled, remembering how Caleb had insisted that she take this position. Not as a favor, but because of her natural ability to connect with people and understand their needs. Lost in thought? Caleb's voice came from behind her, She turned to find him leaning against the doorframe, his tie slightly loosened after a long day of meetings. "Just appreciating how far we've come," she replied, reaching out to straighten his tie. "The new medical debt forgiveness program is already helping dozens of families." Caleb pulled her close, his eyes soft with pride. "That's all thanks to you. Your experience with your own family's struggles gave us the insight we needed to make it work." They walked together to the large windows overlooking the city. The afternoon sun painted the skyline in warm, golden hues. Sophie noticed how different Caleb looked now. Gone was the weight of pretense and obligation. In its place was a quiet confidence, the kind that came from being true to oneself. "The board meeting went well today," he said, wrapping an arm around her waist. "The new investment strategy is paying off. We're not just recovering, we're growing stronger than ever." Sophie leaned into him, remembering the tense days when everything had seemed on the verge of collapse. "I never doubted you would find a way. You just needed to believe in yourself as much as I believed in you." They made their way out to the gardens behind the building, where employees often took their lunch breaks. The space had been Sophie's first project, transforming the formerly austere corporate landscape into a welcoming community area with benches, flowers, and a small fountain. "Remember when you first came here as my nurse?" Caleb asked, their fingers intertwined as they walked the stone path. "I was just a patient to you then." Sophie squeezed his hand. "And now look at us, partners in every way that matters." "More than partners," he corrected gently. "You're my compass, Sophie. You help me stay focused on what truly matters." They reached their favorite spot, a quiet corner beneath a maple tree. The late afternoon light filtered through the leaves, creating dancing patterns on the ground. Sophie felt a deep sense of contentment wash over her. This was where she belonged, not as the nurse who had once timidly entered a billionaire's mansion, not as a charity case he had helped, but as his equal, his partner, his love. Caleb turned to face her, his eyes reflecting the same peaceful happiness she felt. "I never thought I could have this. Success without compromise, love without conditions." Sophie touched his cheek softly. "Sometimes the best things in life come when we stop trying to control everything and just let our hearts lead the way." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the sky in brilliant shades of pink and orange. Their hands remained clasped, a simple gesture that spoke volumes about their journey from patient and nurse to true partners in life and love. The garden at Caleb's estate bloomed with white roses and delicate baby's breath, creating a natural archway where 50 of their closest friends and family gathered. Sophie stood before a vintage mirror in the upstairs guest room, her fingers smoothing the simple silk wedding dress that fell in elegant lines to the floor. No elaborate ball gown or designer label, just a classic, timeless piece that made her feel like herself. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," her mother said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. The past few months had healed old wounds, with Caleb's foundation helping not just Sophie's family, but dozens of others facing similar struggles. Sophie took a deep breath, touching the small bouquet of wildflowers in her hands. "I never imagined this day would come," she admitted, remembering how she'd first walked into this house as a nurse, uncertain and overwhelmed. A soft knock at the door announced her father's arrival. "It's time, Princess," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Sophie turned to him, seeing the pride in his eyes as he offered his arm. The ceremony space was intimate and personal, just as they'd wanted. Fairy lights twinkled in the early evening light, and soft classical music played as Sophie made her way down the garden path. But everything else faded away when she saw Caleb. He stood waiting for her, looking handsome in his navy suit, but it was his expression that took her breath away. Gone was any trace of the guarded businessman she'd first met. Instead, His face showed pure joy and love as he watched her approach. Their eyes met, and Sophie felt tears welling up. This wasn't the elaborate society wedding many had expected from a man of Caleb's status. Instead, it was exactly what they both wanted: genuine, heartfelt, and surrounded by people who truly cared about them. "You're stunning," Caleb whispered as she reached him, taking her hands in his. The officiant, an old friend of Caleb's family, began the ceremony with warm words about love's power to transform and heal. Sophie and Caleb had written their own vows, simple but meaningful promises to each other. "Sophie," Caleb began, his voice steady but full of emotion, "you came into my life when I was lost in darkness, both literally and figuratively. You saw past my wealth, past my status, to the person I really am. You challenged me to be better, to be honest with myself and others. I promise to love you, support you, and walk beside you as your equal partner in all things." Sophie squeezed his hands, her own voice clear despite her tears. "Caleb, you've shown me what true strength looks like, not in power or position, but in the courage to be vulnerable and real. I promise to stand by you, to remind you of what matters most, and to love you completely, just as you are." They exchanged rings, simple bands that represented their commitment to each other. The metal felt warm against Sophie's skin as Caleb slipped it onto her finger, his touch gentle and sure. The officiant's words floated over them. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Caleb drew Sophie close, and their kiss was sweet and tender, filled with promise. Around them, their guests applauded, but Sophie and Caleb remained in their own world for a moment longer. As they turned to face their loved ones, their hands naturally found each other, fingers intertwining. They looked at each other, both knowing that this was just the beginning of their journey together. No more pretense, no more complications, just two people who had found their way to each other against all odds, ready to face whatever life brought their way.